Hey, Michael Lee, you want to raise your hand? They're new visiting scientists. Michael Lee has an announcement at the end of the seminar in case I forget, but I hope not to. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Kerstin Wasson is research coordinator at Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, otherwise known as ESNR. And we were just talking, and it turns out we're academic siblings, or maybe academic cousins, because we didn't necessarily share the same graduate advisor. But I did know her PhD advisor a little bit. She earned her PhD in 1996 from UC Santa Cruz with Todd Newberry, and where she studies invertebrate reproduction and development. And anyone who knows Todd Newberry is aware of his cosmic awareness of the invertebrates. His focus and drive derives from a highly rarefied intellectual space that seems to reside only between his ears, yet spawns observations of the complexity of nature rendered with crystal clarity. And this rubbed off onto Kerstin. But yet this was Kerstin's academic upbringing. Highly intellectual studies of simple creatures bearing complex life histories, behaviors, and morphologies. Her public works focused on bryozoans, porcelain crabs, and more recently, oysters, eelgrass, and otters. She's since held teaching positions both at University of Washington and with the California State University at Humboldt State. Kerstin joined ESNR as a full-time neighbor of Moss Landing Marine Laboratories in 2000, and although her heart and head are in the science, her boots are firmly planted in the practical. Getting stuck in the mudflats of Elkhorn Slough since 1990, it's here at ESNR that the very nature of her focus shifted to include conservation and habitat resilience as part of her passion. She describes her work as existing at the interface between academic research and applied conservation practice. And I suggest that many of us who are in the pure sciences also are feeling a compelling need to integrate our understanding into conservation as well. So please thank the Chemical Oceanography Group and the lab for food and drink, and Kerstin for her presentation today entitled Rising to the Challenge, Salt Marsh Resilience at Elkhorn Slough.
I think that's about the most thoughtful introduction I've ever received, so thank you for doing that so carefully. Yeah, I'll stand up here. So I'm going to be talking to you about salt marshes at the slough. Do I need to, like that. But I wanted to just start with a little bit of background on our program. So at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, our goal is to protect and restore the estuary through education, through management, and through science. And it's the science program that I'm a part of, and there are 5 of us. None of us work full-time exactly, but 5 of us on the research staff. And this is very different than the academic research that I started with, that most of you are familiar with, where you're kind of grounded in a topic or grounded in a taxon. This is grounded in a place. So we're all kind of jacks of all trade, focusing on taking care of this special place. And one core of what we do is long-term monitoring, because that's something that a short-term graduate study or visiting scientist or something can't do, but we're there for the long haul and can really fill that niche of tracking the health of the estuary over time consistently. So that's where a lot of our energy goes. And to do that, we engage a lot of citizen scientists to help us, since we're not very many people. For instance, doing bird surveys, sea otter surveys, one of our volunteers is here, and water quality monitoring. You know, the spacing is different than on my screen. My text scrolls differently. And the goal of a lot of our research is to inform management decisions. Just as one example, our stewardship staff were trying to decide whether to remove eucalyptus trees on the reserve. And so they asked us to do a comparison of what kind of native communities are in coastal live oak versus eucalyptus groves on the reserve. And we looked at a variety of indicators. Turned out the birds didn't care much either way, but native understory plants and amphibians and insects cared quite a bit. And so you can enhance native wildlife use by restoring eucalyptus back to the oak. So just sort of an example, it resulted in a published paper, but more importantly, we're now cutting down eucalyptus trees as a result of it. And we also do restoration experiments. The ones that I've been most heavily involved with is of our native oysters, which are very rare in Elkhorn Slough. They used to be abundant, and we're trying to make sure they don't go locally extinct. So that was my overview of my work, but I'm going to focus today on salt marsh resilience at Elkhorn Slough. So here's a little outline of what I'm going to cover, and once a teacher, always a teacher. I'm kind of going to be teaching you some things I know about salt marshes and highlighting a few of our research projects at the same time and inviting you to do some research in these areas too. So starting with why we should care about salt marshes. One reason we should care is that they're rare, a rare habitat type on this coast. Estuaries are pretty few and far between here compared to, say, on the Atlantic coast, where it's a really common habitat type. So rarity is one type of value. And there are plant communities that are only found in our salt marshes. So the dominant pickleweed that you can see out your window here in the back is really almost entirely found in estuaries, as well as some other diversity of marsh plants that you tend to see in the high intertidal, such as the salt marsh dodder, saltgrass, and a variety of other species. In addition to the plants, there's animal use of our salt marshes. So birds use the marshes. This is a breeding colony of Caspian terns on a salt marsh island. A lot of birds rest on the salt marsh when they're not feeding. They can hunt there, like this peregrine killing a shorebird. And of course, there's marine mammals using the salt marsh ecosystems too. This is taken right outside your window again. And the work that our volunteer Ron is engaged with has shown that salt marsh ecosystems play a really important role in the recovery of the southern sea otter. We have the highest density of mother-pup pairs anywhere in the range of the species living in tidal creeks at Elkhorn Slough. And in addition, just the salt marsh detritus helps support the general food webs, clams and crabs and shrimp and so on in the estuary. Another sort of ecosystem service that marshes provide is improving the water quality. This is something we need because the estuary is surrounded by steep slopes of farm fields with a lot of polluted runoff entering the estuary. As you can see, for example, in this drone photograph taken by my office mate during or the day after one of those El Nino storms, where you can see a muddy plume of water coming off a farm field and entering the estuary. Marshes also provide shoreline protection, protecting infrastructure like this railroad track, which shouldn't really be in the salt marsh to begin with, but it is. The marsh is helping protect it. And then sort of a fashionable ecosystem service these days is blue carbon, the idea that salt marshes take a lot of carbon dioxide up and lock it up in perpetuity in their anoxic sediments. And we've actually been measuring this recently because we were able to get a $3 million grant. We're releasing so much methane and nitrous oxide that it offset the benefit of the carbon sequestration. That wouldn't be good, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So those are the sort of ecosystem services rationales for conserving salt marshes. So then what does a salt marsh need to be happy? Like any other plant, these basic elements that plants need, light, nutrients, moisture, soil, light is usually not an issue in salt marshes because there's nothing to shade the canopy. It's an issue for an individual seedling trying to grow under a canopy of pickleweed. Light can definitely be limiting, but in terms of whether there was salt marsh there or not, light is not the limiting factor. Nutrients can come in with the ocean and from freshwater runoff, and the plants do grow better with more nutrients, but we have no shortage of nutrients coming into this system. So it's not a limiting factor for our salt marshes. And in fact, we have some evidence that we're getting too much nutrients, and I'll talk about that a little bit, what it means for marshes. So the moisture for salt marsh plants, some of it's fresh water coming in with runoff or rains or rivers, but really when we think about moisture in salt marshes, we're thinking about the daily inundation by the tides rising and falling in the marsh. And this is probably the most critical factor for understanding the health and the resilience of a salt marsh. On the upper end, you see the pretty sharp boundary there of the, I'm pointing at myself, of the salt marsh. That is set probably by desiccation, that there's not enough moisture. That's the point at which there is no tidal inundation and the marsh plants can't survive, as well as some competition from upland plants maybe. But at the bottom end, again, you get a pretty abrupt boundary for salt marshes. It's too much inundation, that if the plants are submerged more than 20% of the time or something, then their roots get anoxic, sulfides build up and so on, and it kills the plants. So inundation, tidal inundation and moisture correlate really well with elevation, where they're sitting in the tidal frame, just like in the rocky intertidal, that the barnacle zone is in a different place than the mussel zone. This is a LiDAR map of Elkhorn Slough, and the elevations between mean high water and mean higher high water are shown in bright green, and that corresponds almost exactly to where the healthy marshes are in Elkhorn Slough. Elevation explains a huge part of marsh health. So if you look at an area here near Seal Bend, for instance, it's bright green, versus an area up here across from Kirby Park and our North Marsh, and it's sort of brownish. My aerial photo here isn't great, but you can see the salt marsh is healthy in that lower area that had the high elevation, and you see sort of algae and mud flats and dying salt marsh in the lower area. And then soil is critical too because it counters the elevation issues. Soil helps the marsh build up horizontally, so we have bank erosion. Bank erosion is common in pretty much any estuarine system around the world, and it's countered by having a lot of sediment to replace those eroding banks. And then for vertical processes, the marsh plane needs to build upward to track sea level rise, and one way marshes can do that is by having sediment inputs. So both at the horizontal edges of the marsh, and if you can picture this sort of coming out towards us for vertical growth of the marshes, they need sediment. And this is what it looks like when a marsh is not happy. This is unfortunately what a lot of our marshes look like at Elkhorn Slough. This is across from Kirby Park. The whole sort of top part of the slough has many marshes that are converting to mudflats or already have converted to mudflats. This is what marsh drowning looks like. And we think this is, the proximate cause for sure is that it's too waterlogged, that it's too low and it's too waterlogged. But what the ultimate factor was that led to that is probably many factors, but one of them is that the sediment supply has been cut off. Another is that eutrophication can be actually increasing organic decomposition rates. So the organic soil building that marshes usually do is countered by organic decomposition by microbes. And when we measure the elevation of our marshes in places like this, we actually find they're sinking. So instead of rising, they're sinking. So just sort of to review what marshes need, light hasn't been a problem, nutrients not at Elkhorn Slough so much, maybe too many nutrients are a problem. But moisture and soil are the two factors that are really counter to each other. Marsh can't be inundated too much. A way it can escape inundation is to be building itself up with soil. So then to put that in the context, now that we're all on the same page about what marshes need, how have humans screwed that up in the last 100 years? And let me count the ways. So probably the biggest effect on salt marshes has been diking and draining. There was really this feeling that wetlands were terrible places that should be reclaimed and converted to agriculture. We have lots of newspaper articles from the Castroville Argus and the Salinas paper saying, what a great thing, somebody built a levee across Morocco and turned that terrible place into good farmland. You know, that was the philosophy, was that these were wastelands that were of no use and that we should convert them to better land uses. Here, these farm fields are on sort of my workplace. That's the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, seen in 1956 with its former salt marshes being farmed. And something like 50% of the historic estuary is still behind water control structures and levees today. So we used to have this vast interconnected system with Bennett Slough and Elkhorn Slough and Morocco Slough, Tembladero Slough, the old Salinas River channel, and historic reports of this huge tidal prism and the tide rising and falling in Castroville and in Salinas from this huge system. And about half of that looks like little ag ditches today. I mean, you would see it and you would think it was an ag ditch, but it's an arm of a historic estuary. But even in the main Elkhorn Slough channel, where most of those dikes have been broken, there's a legacy. So this is, again, the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, and this is an area that if we had a photo 200 years ago, it would be dense salt marsh with pretty tidal creeks running through it, and now it's this sort of mud lagoon. And what happened is that in the period that it was diked and drained, it subsided by 3 feet or so. So if you think of like a kitchen sponge that dries out, wetland soils will compact when they're dried. And so when it was 3 feet lower, then when the area was open to tidal exchange, it was now at an elevation that gets inundated 70% of the time, far beyond what salt marsh can tolerate, and it turned into mudflat instead of salt marsh. And so if you look back at that elevation map, pretty much all these brown areas, or all of them, are due to that subsidence from diking. So the railroad, you can sort of almost squint and see where the railroad runs through here. When the railroad went in the 1870s, landowners to the east of it found that levee a really easy way to dike off their wetlands. The railroad originally left the tidal creeks open under bridges, but it was easy to just plug up those openings, and pretty much everything east of the railroad tracks in Elkhorn Slough was diked at some point or another and subsided. And so all these areas, if we had had a LiDAR image of the slough from 200 years ago, it would all be bright green. But now it's brown, it's lower, it's mudflat instead of marshes. And so what can we do about that? One thing we can do is put some sediment back in, and I'll tell you about a project we're doing exactly that on. Then a totally different type of human alteration of our system is the opening of the harbor mouth that is in your backyard here. So originally Elkhorn Slough would have had a much smaller mouth, like here. So this is, Jetty Road would be about here. Here's a harbor mouth drawn in slough mouth drawn in 1854. And it opened jointly with the Salinas River, had this sort of bend. This would have been a configuration that dampened the tidal energy coming into the system. And our historic records show the mouth was very dynamic. It moved a mile north, a mile south. Sometimes it was completely south of here. So, it was a dynamic system, as estuaries tend to be. But then in 1946, the Army Corps of Engineers punctured through these sand dunes here and put in this permanent, deep, wide mouth to the estuary in line with the Monterey Canyon, which really increased the tidal energy in the system. And that's led to bank erosion. If any of you have kayaked up Elkhorn Slough, this is a familiar sight that you see the chunks of bank coming off from the fast tidal currents. And so what can we do about that? It's a hard one to tackle, but we did a recent project near the railroad bridge entrance to most of the reserve. We built an underwater sill that's connected here and shrinks the opening size to an area that accounts for 1/3 of the volume of the slough to sort of slow the water on its way out and decrease the erosion a little bit. Another big alteration to the system is decrease in freshwater input. So an estuary is supposed to be where the river meets the sea, where freshwater and salty water mingle, right? And our main freshwater source was the Salinas River, and which wouldn't have always flown through Elkhorn Slough, but it looks like it did a lot of the time, and paleocores showed episodic flood sediment deposits that were clearly, big riverine pulse flood events that were building our marshes. This is what the Salinas River looks like today as it flows towards us, towards Potrero Road, leaving the Salinas River Lagoon through this water control structure. So we've lost our river, and then on top of that, groundwater was really important. There's lots of historical documents about freshwater seeps all along the edges of the slough and artesian wells bubbling up. And in those places, there were sedges and rushes and cattails growing in amongst the pickleweed, and we've lost that diversity. And there's a lot of studies showing that salt marshes are more resilient to sea level rise with freshwater inputs because they build more organic material, they're more productive, they build more organic material, and so they're able to track sea level rise better if they have freshwater inputs. So the use of freshwater for agriculture has really affected our estuary. And then eutrophication, the high nutrient inputs that come in right in front of the Marine Lab, and then under the Highway 1 bridge and up into the slough, as well as from the surrounding Elkhorn watershed. The farms along Elkhorn Slough have given us really high nitrate levels in the estuary. And like I said, we think that a big part of this story of what's happening with our marshes, we see most of the marsh dieback in the areas with the worst eutrophication, with long residence time of the water. So if you kayak through the slough, the first marshes you come to after you go through the Highway 1 bridge are actually looking pretty good. And it's only when you get further up the slough that the marshes start looking very bad. And with more nutrients, plants invest less in roots. This is true of your house plants too, that if you fertilize them a lot, they'll grow more shoot and less root. And marsh plants do that, so they're investing less organics underground, and then there's this faster decomposition from the microbes. So, the blue carbon value of estuaries is probably decreased with nutrient input. It'd be neat to actually look at that and see if that's true. But eutrophication, not good for our estuary. Then there's some other threats that play a more minor role. Cattle used to be allowed to graze on our salt marshes in a bunch of places. Now there's hardly any. But this is your classic ecology fence line photo. The foreground has the area the cattle have access to. You can see the marsh is not looking so good while the background has them fenced out. And we had a part of the reserve that had cattle all the way down to the water's edge, and now we've built fences so we can have cattle benefiting our grasslands but not harming our marshes. And human trails too have an impact. So this is one that we actually experimentally put into the marsh. We were looking at the effect of trampling, but trampling even by humans isn't good. And so we try to get people out on boardwalks when we bring school groups out and so on to avoid that trampling. We have invasive species growing along the edges of our marshes, things like poison hemlock and ice plant. And for that, there's a nice simple fix compared to most of the problems in that we can try to take out the most aggressive of them. So that's sort of my summary through, in general, what the threats to Elkhorn Slough salt marshes have been. Diking, and what can we do? Restore tides to these places, add sediment where they've shrunk, where the sediments have shrunk. Erosion, we can try to reduce currents. Decreased freshwater inputs, it'd be great to restore, recharge groundwater in some areas. Eutrophication, we need better policies regulating nutrients. Trampling, we want to limit access. And invasions, we can try to prevent and restore them. So I've talked to you about our agricultural inputs. People call San Francisco Bay the urban estuary. We think of Elkhorn Slough as the agricultural estuary. And I wanted to tell you about one particular study we did recently looking at how might ulva be affecting our salt marshes. And this was actually motivated by an observation of Ron, who's sitting here, who's out watching the otters all the time at the slough. And he's like, man, that ulva really piles up on the edges of the salt marsh and looks like it's killing it, and then, the roots aren't going to be holding the sediment so well, it could be causing erosion. So he got us interested in this. I usually go to places where I can walk to the marsh from the upland, so I don't get this view as often as somebody who's out on the boat every day, but he noticed that. And so we asked, has algal rack increased over time with nutrient loading? Like maybe we have normal levels, but we're thinking they're probably abnormally high. Where on the marsh do we get the algal rack, and how are the marsh edges affected? So for how it increased over time, Charlie Endress, our GIS guru, who's a graduate of here, did a GIS analysis from our photos that go back to 1931 and made sort of a grid over the slough, and you'll see highlighting in the boxes where he saw bleached out algae at least a meter in size in a square. So if I just click through over time, 37, 49, 56, 80 wasn't such a high year, 87, 2001, and then 2014. Has there been any increase in algal rack over time? It sure looks like it, even though this is sort of a crude method because the photos are taken at different tide levels and algal blooms are episodic. But here's the pattern if you graph it over time, and it looks like a pretty clear increase in algal rack. And we can correlate that with the agricultural inputs, whether it's fertilizer sales or nitrate concentrations. There's a pretty good correlation there. So it looks like we're growing a whole lot of lettuce and seed lettuce with the same nutrients in the estuary. So where on the marsh does it occur? That same GIS analysis was useful for that. Like if I zoom in, you can see that it's the edges, those edges that Ron had noticed in the boat, that are most affected by algal rack. This is looking at how many years out of the 8 photos he looked at was rack present, and the ones with rack present in a lot of years are the hot colors, the red there. And it's not every edge that's affected, so fetch and currents and all, affect westerly facing edges, and around the bend of a curve and whatever are most affected. But the worst hit places are always edges, even if not every edge is affected. And so then we wanted to know, well, what is this rack doing? And we did field monitoring by boat of 15 sites along the main channel, and had a rack index where we said, is that from 0 to 3? How much rack do we see? And then one time we got out of the boat and collected the rack and dried it and weighed it. And there was a really nice correlation between the rack index that we were estimating by boat and the actual dry weight of ulva that reassured us that we were, looking at something real here. And while we were off the boat, we also assessed the Marsh Health pulled off the rack. So here you can see a patch of salt marsh where we've pulled the algae off, and you can see that it's sort of sickly looking compared to the adjacent non-covered marsh. And if we look at indicators like marsh percent cover, it declines with that rack index, or marsh canopy height, it declines with the rack index. And this is a noisy data set because we were looking at different elevations of marsh and different sediment types and whatever, but it's pretty suggestive. And then we also looked at the bank erosion rates at those 15 sites along the main channel, and measured the distance to the bank edge at a 1-year interval. And this was shocking to me. I hardly ever get an R² this good with observational field studies. So my 15 points fell really nicely into a relationship that the marsh retreat rate, the rate at which the marsh was moving back, so here maybe it's 50 centimeters from the edge, the rate at which it retreated correlated really well with a rack index. So it looks like the algae is killing the marsh and it's backing up there. And then we also looked at the actual erosion rate, the distance to the edge, and that had not quite as strong a relationship, but still a pretty strong relationship with rack. So, we think of the harbor as causing bank erosion, but it's clearly a multifaceted thing where the harbor and eutrophication together may be really a problem. And then we did a field experiment where we could, test this and not just do an observational study. We picked up rack here at behind the whole enchilada, where you can always get some in summer, and placed it on plots or didn't that we'd fenced to keep the rack in or out. And we found the same sort of patterns, that if we had no ulva, the marsh percent cover was much higher than in the treatments with ulva added, and vegetation retreat rate was also much higher if you added ulva than if you didn't. Though, interestingly, you can see we actually had marsh retreat even in our control plots. And this is actually not at the experimental site, but at another monitoring site in the same period. We saw this marsh dieback, and I'll touch on that a little, what was happening in our controls a little later on. So to sum up, has algal rack increased over time with nutrient loading? Yes, it has. Where on the marsh does it occur? The edges are hit hardest. And how are the marshes, are edges affected? We saw decreased plant health and increased vegetation retreat and bank erosion. So our conclusion is that eutrophication is directly affecting the marshes through decomposition and causing the marsh plain to subside, and in this more indirect way by growing crops of algae that end up on the marsh and killing the edges. But again, I want to emphasize that it's really a good example of multiple stressors, that you have this convergence of the harbor giving us high current speeds, the algae killing the plants on the edge, a lack of sediment supply to rebuild the edges, and sea level rise all working together on this system. So speaking of sea level rise, we all are familiar with the idea of the greenhouse effect, and that's through melting of ice as well as thermal expansion going to lead to acceleration in the sea level rise rates with huge uncertainty. This is actually an older figure now. There's even steeper curves on there, but huge uncertainty about exactly what the sea level rise rates will be, but they'll be accelerating. If you look at our nearest tide station at Monterey, we haven't seen any sign of this yet. Some of our counterpart national estuarine research reserves in the Atlantic have really seen some acceleration. Our oceanographic conditions have prevented that for now. But if you look in the shorter term, this is the sea level, the water level anomalies. You can just pull this off the NOAA website. And you can see that sea level is higher and lower primarily due to ENSO, but other factors around here. And the last few years, sea level was maybe a good 10 centimeters higher than it had been on average the previous years. And 10 centimeters is a lot for plants that are really sensitive to differences in inundation. And so that plot I showed you earlier, if you've been out kayaking in the slough or walking around the last few years, there's like a brown dead ring at the bottom of our salt marshes, and I think those plants were living right at the edge of their tolerance, and just being submerged 5% more of the time or something has killed it off. They're actually starting to recover now, so the water levels have dropped and they're starting to look better now, but the last few years things looked really bad. We saw pans expanding, edges looking bad. My sentence is behind there. So marshes, actually I think I'll just skip that. So to have resilience to sea level rise, what's going to help our salt marshes is if you already have high marshes, there are some high marshes around, they're safer. An example is the marsh outside your window here. There's one at Hudson Landing. There are some marshes that are high. They're going to be safer for longer. And then elevation change, if you can have your marshes rising up, they're going to be able to be resilient. That in turn is affected by sediment supply, eutrophication, so sediment supply building it up, eutrophication that can pull it down, and groundwater overdraft I hadn't mentioned, but that can also cause subsidence. Like around Venice Lagoon, the salt marshes have sunk really substantially. The whole town has sunk substantially, and groundwater overdraft is considered the major factor there, as well as diversion of rivers that's led to decreased sediment supply. So a lot of our research is about very precisely understanding elevations of the marsh, of the whole system with LIDAR. This is a surface elevation table where you measure the exact elevation of the marsh with pins that you drop in the same place, and measuring water levels. There's Ron again, gets around. And so for Elkhorn Slough, the NOAA graph I just showed you said that our sea level rise in the last 3 decades has been about 1.4 millimeters a year. When we measure accretion of sediment, so we put down feldspar marker horizons, bright white, and then sediment piles up on it, and you can cut it out and measure how much sediment is on top of that. We're getting 3 millimeters a year. That looks like we should be doing great, keep tracking sea level rise. But with the surface elevation tables, we're measuring that we're actually sinking on average 2.1 millimeters a year. So we're only doing 0.9 millimeters a year of rise, which is less than the current rate of sea level rise. So we're really in deep trouble when it comes to accelerated sea level rise unless parts of the equation can change. And this has led our research. I collaborated with a colleague at Narragansett Bay, and we did an assessment of this sort of marsh resilience across 16 of the National Estuarine Research Reserves. So there's 28 of us, and the green ones, at the green 16, we did an assessment of how are the marshes doing, looking at 5 categories of marsh resilience. How high is the marsh? Is it rising? Is it accreting sediment? What's the sediment supply to? The tidal range and sea level rise. The tidal range is sort of a non-intuitive one, but if you have a big, long tidal range, 10 centimeters of sea level rise is a small proportion of that, while for some of these really micro-tidal estuaries that just have a tiny tidal range, the same 10 centimeters can be a huge proportion of that, so that's why it matters. And so we compiled data in these categories. Here, for instance, is Great Bay, New Hampshire, and we have these categories. The greener the color coding, the better. So this is one that has good marsh elevation, good elevation change, quite a bit of sediment, a big tidal range, hasn't experienced much sea level rise, and so it gets an overall good resilience index. But the next estuary to the south on Cape Cod, Waquoit Bay, actually looks very different. It turns out it's subsiding, it doesn't have much sediment, it has a small tidal range, and so it got this overall low resilience score. And these are actually kind of exceptions, that they look sort of all green or all red. Most of the 16 reserves, when we looked at it, kind of had a mix. Their overall score was kind of in the moderate zone. Elkhorn Slough, here we are, got sort of a moderate score. But all of us had some risk factors. This is us sinking, this is our elevation change, but we have a big tidal range that buffers us, so most places were a mix. But it's just an example of where we can use the strength of this network of protected marine sites to do syntheses and look at sort of how are our marshes doing across the nation. So from this Marsh Resilience study, which is coming out in Biological Conservation in a couple weeks, we have this approach for evaluating marsh resilience through coordinated monitoring, and we've got an Excel tool that we are putting out that anyone can use to look at their salt marshes. And we showed this sort of moderate level of national risk, but as an early warning system, we detected some areas that are really in trouble already. And our main point is that this sort of marsh resilience index is not an academic exercise, but can be linked to what you should do management-wise. So if we look at like a site that got a really high score, this is China Camp up in San Francisco Bay, it got a really high score. What you want to do for that marsh is make sure it has the best possible protection. Like supposing there were marshes like that in private hands. We have marshes in Elkhorn Slough that are in private hands. Those marshes that get high scores, we want to protect them because they're likely to be there for the next century. If you have an intermediate score, you might want to just support that marsh through some restoration, like if you can restore some riverine sediment inputs or remove the invasive species or decrease pollution. But for the sites that have the lowest scores, they're probably not going to make it through the next 100 years of sea level rise, and it might be throwing good money after bad to try to restore those marshes. So for those places, you probably have to focus on either facilitating migration to new higher ground or bringing in sediment, creating new higher marshes. And so that brings me to my last point of restoring resilience at Elkhorn Slough. How can we support our marsh resilience? And certainly decreasing stressors like the nutrient inputs is one important way. But facilitating migration is another way. So this is NOAA's sea level rise viewer. If you've ever played around with it on the web, you can look at your favorite part of coast and flood it with different amounts of sea level and so on. So it can show salt marshes. They're in purple here, brackish and magenta and saltier in purple. But anyway, purple is where today's salt marshes are. If we add a lot of sea level rise, 6 feet, you see Elkhorn Slough has almost no salt marshes left, and the salt marshes are down here. So that's when you drive down Highway 1 towards Castroville and look to your left and right at these beautifully productive, very valuable farmland. That's where tomorrow's salt marshes want to be, and that's going to just pose a challenge. But at some point, maybe the farmers will be willing sellers when there's a lot of flooding and salty water around, and we need to think ahead and be preparing for where the salt marshes of tomorrow will be. But then the other thing we can do is raise up, not throughout the whole slough, but in targeted places to make sure the slough has a few salt marshes left in 100 years. And we've picked one site, which is one of these brown, formerly diked, subsided areas that used to be salt marsh. Here's a sort of grainy photo, but this is dense salt marsh with tidal creeks running through. Looks sort of like China Camp looks today. That's how it looked historically. Here's how it looks today. It's mostly mud flat and algae on there. And we were able to get sediment that was being dredged out of the Pajaro River to prevent flooding and stockpile it on our site right adjacent to the marsh while we waited to get funding and permits, which we now have. And we're also going to scrape a bit of the adjacent hillside to get some more sediment. And the idea is to place the sediment in this area. You'll recognize the sort of boot-shaped footprint of the historic salt marsh. We're going to build it up not only to its former height, but a bit higher, so it's ready for tomorrow's sea level rise. And this area does not probably need planting because there's so many pickleweed seedlings that are out there that should colonize. And the idea is that we're going to have a high marsh plain, maybe ideally like the one out the window here. The salt marsh outside your window here is a new one. The Salinas River used to be much wider with just a narrow fringe of salt marsh along it. And as the tidal prism was reduced and water became more sluggish, and as sediment came in down the Salinas River, the marshes here have built up fairly recently into robust, nice-looking marshes. And so that's the sort of model we're looking for. And we're going to do some monitoring there, put in groundwater wells like this one, and measure the carbon sequestration because it's paying the bills. And that was a Moss Landing graduate, too. Monitor how sea otters are using the new marsh. But like Charlie here, we're always in a hurry and we don't have much bandwidth. So I wanted to really put out an invitation to the new students in the room who might still be looking for projects. This is going to be kind of exciting to have a bare area that has nothing on it be colonized by salt marsh. Here's pickleweed seedlings in a very small restoration area we had before. So this is going to be about a year from now that we're hoping to start the construction 6 months from now and be done about a year from now. And then we're going to watch what happens. And there's a lot of questions that could be asked about sort of sediment processes. How does denitrification start happening in these sediments? About animal colonization, which invertebrates show up first and so on, and we do not have the bandwidth to do that, so we'd love to have student theses out there, or even caging studies. If you wanted to do experimental studies, we'd welcome you looking or soil amendments or manipulative experiments as well as monitoring would be most welcome out at our project site. And then in the upper part of the marsh, the ecotone where we get those other high marsh species, the conventional wisdom is they don't disperse and recruit very well, and so you have to plant them. And so we're going to plant, the current plan is 5 little blocks that we're planting, 25,000 plants that are now being grown in our greenhouse, 7 different species. And they're going to be grown in sort of sub-blocks within those planted blocks, maybe meter by meter of the same species. And what I'm going to be focusing on is looking for these different species at their recruitment, their dispersal between patches, how they may facilitate each other, and their carbon sequestration rates. But there's tons of other things you could do. We're going to have these plantings of, very specific species in exactly the same area, and you could look at herbivory by putting out cages. You could look at ecosystem services of these different species, like are some better at carbon sequestration than others, denitrification than others. You could look at what animals use them. Is there greater animal diversity in some? So since we have this huge experiment going in, we'd love to have extra people come make parts of it their thesis and publish on it. That would be great. So we'll be out there, as we always are, in the salt marsh, but we hope that some of you come out too, and I hope you've gained appreciation and understanding of our salt marsh ecosystems and can see why we want to conserve and restore them. Thank you.
Would you be willing to entertain some questions?
Of course.
Have at it, you guys.
Diana.
Hi, you mentioned erosion, but I haven't heard the latest on what. There was talk for years about putting a dam under the bridge to slow the flow. So could you talk, since you spoke about that, and that was just one of the things.
Yeah, so, one thought was, could we somehow shrink the mouth of the estuary back to its historic size by building sort of a submerged dam under the Highway 1 bridge? Or another proposal was build a complete dam under the Highway 1 bridge and then route the slough out through Bennett Slough up north of Jetty Road so that the harbor can do its own thing and the estuary can do its own thing, and they're uncoupled. And we had a big interdisciplinary team studying the pros and cons of this, and it was an interesting process because we thought originally the harbor mouth was the great villain in the room. That was sort of what I had inherited, that worldview, and that our salt marsh loss must be due to the harbor. And as a result of actually bringing in salt marsh ecologists from San Francisco Bay and all, we learned that it actually looks like while the bank loss, the edge loss of salt marsh is due to the tidal currents, that drowning of marshes we see in the interior that has caused most of our marsh loss is more due to eutrophication, and the areas with the strongest tidal energy near the mouth have the healthiest salt marshes, and the ones far away don't. And so first of all, that was a big insight, decoupling that bank erosion and the rest of the marsh loss is different. Ken Johnson was on a part of the team studying this, looking at nutrient dynamics in the estuary, and he's the one who really highlighted that huge nutrient loads are coming past this building and going up into the estuary, and that the slough is really eutrophic, and we hadn't fully gotten that. And so I think we just had a paradigm shift where we're more worried about eutrophication than we are about tidal erosion now. And by building that dam up, you'd actually be likely to make eutrophication worse. So you'd be solving one problem, but making another one worse. And kayaking and marine mammals are such a big thing in the slough, and there were concerns about like whitewater over the dam and all. So we looked at all angles, and our ideas kind of evolved, and we decided not to move forward with those, but instead to move forward with smaller scale projects, medium scale projects like the one I was just talking about. You call him.
In regard to your OLVA experiment, I think you said that you guys you collected and put OLVA in certain areas, and did you compare that to areas with no OLVA or areas where you removed OLVA?
It was areas where we didn't put it on. So we had actually 3 treatments, all in little fences, no ulva for 8 weeks, and ulva for 12 weeks, because we'd wondered whether maybe there's like a Goldilocks, that the plants do actually get some nutrients from the ulva and it could like fertilize them. So maybe if they're just covered for 2 months, they're fine, but then you go past some threshold and they're not. And it turned out that 8 weeks was bad, 12 weeks was even worse, but it was a linear effect, not an intermediate. But yeah, so we were comparing to no ulva added for 8 weeks or 12 weeks.
Do you think you would have seen any recovery in areas removing ulva, or do you think that would have taken a longer period of time?
No, I think so. I think that would have been a good experiment to do too, is to do ulva removal on like some of those edges. That would be a great project.
So it seems like two of the biggest problems and hard to solve are the freshwater input and the nitrogen or the nutrient addition, and that both of those seems like pretty much the only way to fix them is working with the agricultural industry around the slough. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on what that would look like? Is that like, do you have any idea? Like, is it something that you've had any dialogue with farmers and like, basically, do you have any ideas on how to start fixing those problems? Because it seems like a pretty hard nut to crack.
I mean, so I'm not personally the expert at that, but there's a lot of initiatives trying to work with farmers in the region and reduce nutrient inputs in the Salinas River watershed as well as ours. And, I think there's been modest successes. So like the Natural Soil Conservation Service works on a voluntary basis with farmers to install sediment basins and buffers and put grass on roads and so on. But apparently in this area, there's really high turnover. It's mostly absentee owners leasing out land for less than a year sometimes. And so you like do something, do improvements, then the next owner doesn't, and you have to go back again. It's the opposite of like areas where you have family farms that have been in the family for hundreds of years. Then people want to make improvements and take care of the land for generations, but that's not really the history of land ownership here. But so there's been voluntary basis, there's regulatory action, so we provide our water monitoring data to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and they've become aware of how low the oxygen drops and how high the algae are, and that they want to have stronger regulatory approaches, but it's a very slow process to get there. And then there's also land acquisition. So the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, our nonprofit partner, has bought a lot of land in the Elkhorn watershed over the past 10 years, 15 years, and farms that used to be on really steep slopes, they've taken out of production. So that their model is a working landscape, and where there's farms on sort of level ground, where you can have organic agriculture and lower effects, they'll keep part of the property in production, but the really steep slopes, they've restored back to natural habitat. And we had a paper a few years ago looking at improved water quality before versus after when they did restoration. And at a very small scale, right at the adjacent wetlands, you can measure improvements. At the scale of sort of the entire estuary, it's a tiny little needle moving. But there are efforts. I think we're on the right trajectory, but it's not going to happen overnight.
I have a question. There are analogs to these dike regions, for instance, that experience subsidence sinking. And what is the region where they don't complex, San Francisco and Joaquin, Sacramento, Delta complex, where farmland has been diked off from that seasonal irrigation. And there the sinking of those delta islands has been over 20 feet. Those
Yes.
islands are not 20 feet below sea level. It is primarily due, as you say, to peat oxidation and mechanical compaction. Your system is also one that evolved in a freshwater regime where peat oxidation was likely the cause of some of that subsistence. But what you are doing is bringing in inorganic soil matrices to essentially battle sea level rise. How similar are these environments? One that lacks the peat infrastructure or soil structure that it used to have, and freshwater, to one that's pretty much an inorganic soil matrix. How might these still support the type of habitat you
Right.
restore?
Yeah, I mean, come find out is the answer. But pickleweed itself is not real picky, luckily. So yes, our sediment composition, where we've piled in these sandy sediments where there used to be peat and clay and whatever, are going to be very different. We see pickleweed growing on the gravel of the railroad tracks. So we feel confident that we're going to restore it to a visually acceptable pickleweed marsh. But I'm also sure that the microbial processes and, you know, the invertebrates that burrow into those sediments will be different. And it'd be great to, I'll be out there just with a quadrat saying, yep, there's pickleweed, but you guys can come study the sediment dynamics and the microbial processes, and I'm sure they will be different. In terms of the freshwater, I mean, there was sort of a conception that the slough was freshwater for a long time, and we've really sleuthed out from every possible angle, paleo cores looking at pollen, to historical records from the last 100 years, and we just don't see the evidence for that. It was certainly much fresher because it had all these seeps on the edges, but pickleweed accounted for 70% or something of the vegetation for most of the 5,000 years. There were oysters and clams in the Native American middens for 7,000 years. They can't stand periods below 20 parts per thousand for more than a few weeks. So we really think it was a high energy tidal system, saltwater system, contrary to sort of the Mossland paradigm. Yeah, and so these older people like Louis Calcagno living at Moonglow Dairy, or some of the owners, they were children during the peak of the diking. And that's their baseline. It's this shifting baseline. So there were freshwater duck hunting clubs all throughout the slough. And it was fresh in the 1930s. That's a shifting baselines problem.
So the tides also in nitrate, and the concentration isn't nearly as high as the agricultural runoff, but it's happening all the time. So could the tides be part of the eutrophication as well, in addition to the agricultural runoff, or is that just
You mean
so much
the offshore sources, or?
So the tides bringing in nitrate, and the increase of tides might increase that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's offshore in the summer, the Monterey Canyon upwelled water, for instance, it can be an important nutrient source into the slough, and the tides are always what's bringing this water here up. The modeling Ken Johnson did when we were thinking of sills of different heights suggested that even if you have less inputs, the greater residence time is going to cause, more eutrophication. But yeah, I mean, in the solution where you had the slough completely dammed off with its own mouth, it wouldn't be getting those nitrate inputs from here anymore, and you would be dramatically reducing the nitrates in the slough, but to us it's like it's an estuary. You shouldn't cut it off. The same argument has been made. The large Cal-Am project involves using water from various sources from around here, and one of them was taking water out of the Tembladero Slough, one of the last freshwater estuaries in the area, and they were like, oh, nobody needs this, it's just like junk water. It was like thinking from 100 years ago, and that's the major freshwater, natural freshwater source into the slough. And their argument again was like, oh, well, we'd be taking the nitrates out. Isn't that a good thing? But that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater to me to say, oh, let's just cut all the fresh water off from the estuary because it's polluted. No, let's fix the pollution, not take away the natural connectivity with tides and with fresh water.